just wanted to explain briefly the structure of this webinar. Professor Steve Strand will speak to us for about 30 minutes. And after his presentation, there will be time for questions. And I will collect the questions and pose them to Steve. That said, you don't have to wait until the very end of the presentation to type your questions. Feel free to type your questions on the chat box at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen while Steve is speaking, and I will collate them and post them to Steve. But alternatively, if you want to wait until the end, that's also perfectly fine. Tomorrow, you will receive an email from us with a link to access the video recording of this webinar. Enough of me now. It gives me great pleasure to welcome back Professor Steve Strand to our webinar series for the third time. Steve will be speaking to us about the findings from his latest research report, English as an Additional Language, Proficiency in English and Rate of Progression, Pupil, School and LA Variation, which was co-written with Dr. Ariel Lindorf, Research Fellow at the University of Oxford Department of Education. And I'm pleased to report that it has been published today. And it's available to download for free from the Bell Foundation website. You will see the link in a minute. Steve is Professor of Education at the University of Oxford, and he holds a first-class BA Honours and PhD in Psychology. His research interests are in the associations of ethnicity, social class, and gender with a wide range of educational outcomes at all stages of schooling. Steve has over 100 scholarly publications in the field, including international peer-reviewed journal articles, book chapters, and research reports. He has been advisor to the Department for Education and special advisor to the House of Commons Education Select Committee. And Steve is currently a member of the Education Panel for the REF 2021. Over to you, Steve, and good afternoon.
Thanks, that's great. Let me just make sure I've got control of the slides I have. That's a shame. I rather wanted to say next slide, please, Silvana, but I'm just going to have to do it myself. I don't know why you have to say next slide, please. I don't know why they don't have a button, but there you go. Enough of the broadcasting. I'm going to talk about, as I say, for about 30 minutes, hopefully, about what we've learned from data from Wales about EAL and proficiency in English. So you might be saying, why Wales? Probably not if you're from Wales. You might be saying, why not Wales? But if you're from England, you might be saying, why Wales? Well, I suppose a number of reasons, really. It's the same measure of proficiency in English that was made statutory in the England school census in 2017 and 2018. So it's something many of us are familiar with as a measure, having actually used it for 2 years before the government no longer made it a statutory requirement. So it's familiar. Wales have been using this since 2009 and they continue to do it. So it's a fantastic longitudinal data source. It's linked to their pupil level annual school census and all their educational achievement data. So it's a wonderful longitudinal resource that continues to be used, and so there's a lot to learn from it. The EAL population in Wales is smaller than in England. It's around just under 7% in Wales, where it's almost 20% of pupils in England. But importantly, it's comparable in a number of ways. So EAL means not English or Welsh as your first language. So it's the same language groups within the EAL category as it is in England. And also we can identify and exclude from analysis the small number of pupils in English medium schools where Welsh is the language of instruction. Clearly English is not such an important skill if the language of medium instruction is Welsh, but we can take out the small one. There's less than 2%, about 1.8% of EAL pupils in Welsh medium schools, and 98.2% are in English medium schools, so it's a very small issue, but we can trap that out. So we can make the data very comparable to England anyway. And although it's a smaller nation, there's around about 30,000 students in a year group compared to the 600,000 odd in England. But we have a huge data set available here, very kindly provided by the Welsh Government, with 3.5 million student records linked across from 2009 to 2017, and we were able to look at that in many different ways. So it's a more than big enough resource to say something of interest, I think. So I'm going to summarize these two reports. These are the two, and these are the links down the bottom here. If you follow those short, tiny URLs, they'll take you right to the relevant reports. Well, I talked about this one last year, so some of the things I was saying will be reiterating what I said last year, so I won't say it in the same depth, but you can go to the report to see the original, or indeed look at last year's webinar, which is still available. So let's, we're all busy people, so let's get to the sort of 5 headline measures. Obviously talk about these in more detail as we go through, but these are kind of 5 headline messages really. And the first one is basically whether or not a pupil was exposed to a language other than English during their early development. The definition of EAL is actually a very poor indicator of their educational achievement. It's their proficiency in English, where that's the language of school instruction, that's absolutely key. So EAL is not actually a very helpful measure. Proficiency in English is. That's the first really key message. The second is on transition times, and that's that it takes at least 6 years for pupils who arrive in reception as new to English, so age 4 or 5, new to English, at least 6 years for them to transition to competent or fluent, which is the other major finding from the first report. We've also done in the second report these 3 subsequent points. One is we've looked at what kind of pupil factors might be associated with making more or less rapid progress through the different stages of fluency, looking at ethnicity, SEN, gender, entitlement to a free school meal, and school factors as well, school level factors. One of the key things from that, I think, is that pupils of white other ethnic heritage do have particularly low rates of progression. They progress more slowly through the stages of fluency, and they have particularly low levels of attainment. So they are a group possibly in need of extra support within the Welsh context, but also there are read acrosses to England there. And the second finding is around the school level factors. And although there's been a lot of concern that having a high proportion of young people learning English might be a distraction and might be a stress on teachers, taking their attention away from people who are not so needy, there's absolutely no evidence here that the proportion of pupils who are acquiring English has any impact on overall achievement in the school, or indeed on specifically on first language English speakers. So that's very positive, although we do find some compositional effects for free school meals, and I'll say a bit more about the density or the concentration of free school meals and how that's an important factor. And finally, we look at how much variation there is between schools and local authorities in these proficiency ratings and in the progression rates, and there's actually quite a lot of variability between schools, certainly a lot more than we find for other assessments like Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 assessments of achievement. So there is quite a lot of variability between schools, which makes it really important that there are clear and agreed definitions of fluency, clear criteria for assessment, and there are moderation procedures. So without those kind of factors, the chances of using these measures to their full effect is quite limited. So those are the 5 kind of main messages, and I'll go through those in a little bit more detail. So as I say, the major data limitation is that EAL in PLASC or in the National Pupil Database in England is absolutely not an indicator of proficiency. It's recorded when a young person was exposed to a language other than English during their early development, which typically meant during the first 5 years, and they continue to be exposed to that language in the home or in the community, which is a very broad definition. And if they were exposed to English and another language, you still record the other language, and even if they're absolutely proficient in English, you still record the other language. So it's a measure of exposure at a particular point in time. Okay, now that is important in the sense that it's actually not a very good identifier of educational achievement or language learning need. Because although when we hear EAL, we often think about those young people in our classrooms who may be newly arrived to the country, who speak, read or write little or no English. They are absolutely our concern in terms of their ability to access the curriculum and their ability to engage with the whole of school life. They are actually quite a small proportion of EAL pupils. A much larger group actually is young people who were born in the UK, may have been exposed to another language as part of their cultural heritage, and that may not even be like in the home, that may be in the community, but they use English as their everyday language in school and they're absolutely fully fluent in it. So this is a very different context from that first group, and actually these young people may absolutely have achievement which is, and we'll come to see they do, which is often higher than that of monolingual speakers. But it's not just a question about new arrivals, because you could have new arrivals from other countries who've been educated in English medium schools or in bilingual schools abroad and are able to read and write fluently in English and in another language. So you do need some measure of proficiency in English. That's the actual key underlying factor. Now, we've known that for some time, and I don't know why my slides are not advancing. There they are now. And this is a piece of research I did with the Strand Demie from Lambeth Local Authority when I was head of research in Wandsworth Local Authority, a neighbouring authority. Those two authorities share a border. And here are the key stage 2 average point scores of all the pupils in this borough. I think there were around about 2,500 pupils. Around about 37 were EAL. So these are all EAL pupils. Okay, but what's quite clear is that although they're all EAL, and these are monolingual English speakers, there's huge variability in the educational achievement of these young people. Quite clearly, these people who are beginning to learn English are actually about 9 points or 21 points below 21 points, and these are 29 points, so they are 8 points below in terms of their educational achievement at 11. Massive difference. So in fact, these young people who are bilingual, they are fluent in English and they have EAL, are actually doing better than monolingual English speakers. So it's actually knowing what the proficiency in English of young people is, which is key to understanding their educational achievement and their language learning needs. And so we've known this for quite some time, but we're able to look at this with the lens of this 5-stage A2E scale, which, as I say, was originally used in Wales in 2009, continues to be used, and was then adopted for 2 years in England as well. So it's the same concept here we were talking about in the previous slide, the Hilary Hester scales of fluency in English. Here we're talking about a 5-stage proficiency in English. But it's a similar kind of concept. We're looking at those at the early stages who are totally new to English, and then at the early stages of acquisition through to developing competence, where there may be good oral expression but still some structure and accuracies, whatever, through to those competence, right up to those who are fully fluent, okay, who can operate across the curriculum to a level of confidence that's equivalent to an English speaker. And we can look at that in relation to educational achievement, and I've shown here, just for simplicity, the English results, or language communication and English in the case of the Welsh curriculum, age 7, age 11, age 14 and age 16. And we see very much what I showed you in the previous slide, which is essentially that those young people who are acquiring their competence in English, those at A, B and C, tend on average to be achieving lower levels than the monolingual first language English or Welsh speakers, whereas those who are competent or fluent are actually achieving higher levels than monolingual English speakers. So this goes to reiterate the point effectively that EAL itself tells you very little what tells you a lot about achievement is the fluency in the language of school instruction. And that's actually not new. We obviously knew it from the 205 research I talked earlier, but we also did a report in 2018 for the Bell Foundation, which looked at this for England data as well. So in fact, this is kind of reiterating what we already know. So essentially, what we're saying there is EAL is a poor measure because pupils vary so greatly in terms of their proficiency. That's really not a trivial outcome where the language of instruction is English. So this proficiency in English is the most powerful predictor, and we see that those who are new to English or early acquisition tend to be scoring below the average, those who are developing competence around the national averages, and those who are competent or fluent in English as well as with another language often have better outcomes. Yeah, so it's this proficiency measure that is key. Again, I'm not quite sure why I'm not getting my slides to advance. There we go. In that research I talked about earlier, the Strand and Hessel research in 2018, also published by Bell, we found that actually proficiency in English could explain up to 10 times more of the variation in the achievement of EAL pupils than commonly used demographics like ethnicity, gender, and entitlement to a free school meal combined. So it really is the key underlying indicator. Again, I'm having problems in getting my slides to advance. Now they're advancing too fast. Okay. Come on. 2, 3, 4. Ah! So these are two different things. EAL does not mean a pupil has an English language learning need. They may have English language and have no English language learning need. They may actually, as we've seen, be fully fluent and achieving better than non-English speakers. So, you know, equally, if you're fully fluent, it doesn't mean you're no longer EAL. EAL is about a sort of fixed in time exposure during early years in life. Proficiency is about your current ability to engage with the curriculum. So these are two different things, and yet we commonly conflate them. You know, that we read EAL as needing language support. We read fully fluent as not needing language support, therefore not EAL. So we did see in the Welsh database some young people who were competent in reception but never transitioned to be recorded as fluent. Maybe we started being recorded as English or Welsh first language, i.e. not as having a language need. And we also saw that particularly around the year 6, year 7 transition. So secondary schools would look at young people who were fully fluent and record them as not EAL, but they obviously still are EAL, but they're very proficient in English as well. So it's really important to keep these two concepts distinct, and what we need is the measure of proficiency. Now you might say, actually this is really obvious. Is it surprising that young people who are learning English are not going to achieve very well when they're assessed in the curriculum? Yeah, I mean, it is quite obvious, and yet it's a measure that we don't have in England, unlike in Wales and unlike in Scotland, actually. And so I have to keep making this point that it is important, because although we did have it adopted in 2017 and 2018, we don't have it again. It's been removed as a statutory requirement, although many schools are continuing to record it, which I think is very sensible, and I would want to be doing that were I a school leader, but it's not a statutory requirement. So although it may seem blindingly obvious to those of us working with these young people in schools, it has to keep being said, because it's actually not a data item that we record. So that was the first point, really. The second point is about this time to acquisition, because it's a key message for all, a question for all us stakeholders, which is how long does it take for people to acquire proficiency in English, and how long do they need additional language support? Key question for all of us, really. And it's important to bear in mind here the kind of two levels that come into distinguish really between oral fluency and ability to communicate, and academic fluency, really basically the cognitive and academic language. So you might have good conversational communicative skills but still struggle at the higher level of using your language, for creative writing, for having extended vocabulary, those kind of issues about engagement with academic engagement. So there's as a summary of research, I'm not going to go through it all again in the 2020 paper, because there is very limited research that's actually taken genuinely prospective, forward-looking, large, nationally represented samples, and only one UK study. So there is a need for further research in this area, and I'll leave you to read that if you're interested in that particularly. So what we report on in this study is just over 5,500 or just under 5,500 pupils in Wales who entered reception classes in mainstream schools between 2009 and 2011, and were recorded as EAL. And then we tracked these pupils over the subsequent 6 years in primary school, and they completed the teacher assessment of proficiency in English every January. So we were able to track that all the way through from reception through to year 6. And as I said before, first language English or Welsh do not record PI. This is for all those other languages, same as in England. So we've got a large group of EAL pupils we're tracking from reception all the way through to the end of year 6. But the key focus on what I'm going to present here is just over 2,000 pupils who were new to English at level A in reception. And I'm going to be particularly focusing on how those new to English students in reception progress through to higher levels of proficiency. We looked at all the other data as well. So we looked at those who started at B, how long it took them to move to C and D and E, and those who started at C and how long it took for them to move to D and E. But the key focus, I think, for us is those who are new to English at age 4 or 5 and how long it takes them to acquire proficiency. Now obviously in any group there's going to be a range. Some young people are going to take longer, some young people are going to take less time, because there's all the individuality that makes us unique and all the other factors that are involved. So what I was interested in was when have a majority of young people made that tradition? When have more than 50% of young people made the transition from one stage to the next? So that was our kind of key threshold. So those are the key results for that, really. So looking at the top left here, we're looking at time from A to B, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years. So this is effective. You made the transition in year 1, in year 2, in year 3, 4, 5, and 6. And we see that actually a majority transitioned from A to B after 2 years. A majority, looking at the next graph, transitioned from A through to C after 4 years. Okay, so it takes about 2 years to transition from new to English to early acquisition, and about 4 years for new to English through to developing competence. And then importantly, we were able to track these 2,000 all the way to year 6, but at that stage still only just under a third had transitioned to competent or above. So we're talking about not actually having observed the point at which a majority have made that transition, but at least a third have by the end of year 6. So we can say with some confidence it takes at least 6 years to transition from new to English in reception through to competent or above. And this is the time it takes to get to be recorded as fluent. You may wonder why I'm going to emphasize D or E in the future, and I will talk about that towards the end, about this distinction between fluent and competent, which is an important one in theory, but actually the data is quite mixed about how well that's applied in practice. So we're going to talk about transition times from new to early acquisition, developing competence, and competent or above. Some small number of supplementary findings. Those results were all robust to elimination of Welsh medium schools. Importantly, they were robust to when you start school. So that's looking at a group that all start reception together as a class. So actually you might have got all the cohesiveness that goes with that What if you were actually starting at level A, new to English, but you're entering as a singleton in year 1 or 2 or 3? Well, we also were able to follow up just over 2,000 pupils who started at level A sometime in year 1 to year 5 and followed them for 6 years, and actually found exactly the same progression rate. So this is important. This is an empirical finding, not a generalization. It seems that you take the same amount of time whether you're joining in kindergarten, or I shouldn't say kindergarten, I should say reception, or whether you join later in the school year. It still takes at least 6 years to make this transition. We were able to follow a small group of 700 right the way through to year 8 for 8 years, but we still only found 40% had transitioned. So I think that tells us something that we had to be a little bit cautious about the data, and I'll say more about that towards the end of the presentation. But no obvious kind of sudden flip, yeah, if you follow young people on for 1 or 2 further years. So there's our overall conclusion on this second point. 2 years from new to English to early, 4 years to developing, and 6 years to competent fluent. So my third point is, let's have a look at, and that's what this first column does, the time it takes to transition from A to C or from A to D and above, by a range of pupil background characteristics. So what I've got here is a multi-level model which is simultaneously taking into account a large number of student level factors and school level factors, and saying what is the unique contribution or unique association between each of these factors, and in this case, this first column, these times to transition. So one of the things that I'm picking out for you here is that boys tend to take a little bit longer, so a positive coefficient means it's taking you longer to make that transition, as do pupils with SEN, and importantly pupils of white other ethnic heritage. So that's 0.6 of a year longer to make the transition, which is 7 months to transition from new to English through to developing competence, and a third of a year, or 4 months longer than the comparator group would be any other students, including white British, to make that transition. So this particular ethnic group take longer to transition, so this progress more slowly in terms of their acquisition in English, and they are the ethnic group with the lowest educational achievement in Key Stage 1 teacher assessment and Key Stage 2 teacher assessment at 7 and 11. I say Key Stage 1 because I'm used to the English curriculum. This would be foundation stage in the Welsh curriculum, different from foundation stage, which we mean kind of age 4 or 5. This is kind of year 2 results. So it seems to me that that's an important finding for the Welsh context, particularly because white other heritage are the largest ethnic minority group in Wales. They account for 3% of the population in total, but that is 25% of all ethnic minority students in Wales, because Wales, just as it has fewer EAL pupils, tends to have fewer pupils from ethnic minorities relative to England. So it's a big group. It's the biggest group of minority ethnic pupils, and they seem to have both slow progression times and lower levels of achievement. So that's worth flagging up. There are some read across to England. Those are really important results in England as well. And we've also been able to identify in some early research I did for the Educational Endowment Foundation in 2015, that particularly that is associated with languages from Eastern Europe, so actually sort of French, Russian, German, those kind of languages, and white other heritage were not associated with lower achievement, but particularly Latvian, Polish, Lithuanian, those languages were, and obviously also white Roma and Irish travellers. So there are a number of groups within there who are also low achieving in the English context. So that's kind of pupil level factors, but I said in these models we also included school level factors, and that was important because there has been a perennial question about whether there's an impact, and again I've got a bit of a freeze here. an impact on the achievement of pupils of having a high concentration in a school of pupils who are learning English as an additional language. So is there an impact, and a particular focus on whether there might be an impact on first language English speakers. So if the teacher is having to spend a large amount of time in the class dealing with the very pressing needs of young people who don't speak English as an additional language, does that have a negative effect in terms of limiting the amount of time they then have available to deal with other pupils in the classroom who don't have those language learning needs? The earlier research I just referred to from 2015 didn't indicate any association between the proportion or the percentage of young people with EAL in a school and educational achievement. But obviously it was looking at EAL, because at that stage we didn't have a measure of proficiency in English. So maybe a more direct test here would be, does the proportion of young people acquiring English, actually learning English in the classroom, have this kind of association? So the proportion of students at proficiency levels A, B and C. So we can ask a more focused version of that question now. And that's a very wide range. So the range of young people in a classroom or a school, we looked at average data, because a lot of the schools are quite small. We averaged data across 3 years. And looking at that 3-year measure, there were some schools that had no pupils at stage A to C and some that had 92%. So you're looking at really quite substantial range across schools in terms of what proportion are at A stars to C. Stages A to C. We banded that into quintiles, so 5 bands, each containing 20% of the schools. And the mean A to C was very low, 0.1%, 0.7% in the lower 2 quintiles, 2% in the middle, average 20% of schools, and then 5% and 24% in the highest, the top 20% of schools in terms of the proportion of young people at stages A to C. And we included those in the multi-level models that I just talked about earlier. So also controlling for, after we've controlled for like pupil background, is there an additional effect over and above the individual pupil level of being in a school with a high proportion of pupils learning English? And the answer was no. So a long way around, but actually a reassuring result, I think. There doesn't seem to be any negative spillover effect, either on all students overall, or even specifically on young people with the first language other than English of being in a classroom with a high proportion. Now maybe that's because historically the funding has been there to support the needs of those English language learners without having a negative impact, but we shouldn't take that for granted. That could change if the level of funding and the level of support that's available changes. So it's a positive result, but it is something that's related to the time at which the data was collected, and if circumstances change, then the outcomes might change. So we should not take this for granted going forward. We have to keep supporting schools to the level that we have been supporting them in the past in order to be able to keep getting the same outcomes we've got in the past. One thing I'll say that isn't directly related to the EAL issue but was a really strong effect is there was a big school composition effect for how many pupils in the school were entitled to free school meals. So what you can see from the previous figure I showed you, if you look for example at Key Stage 2 achievement, is that pupils who are eligible for free school meals are scoring around about 0.22 of a national curriculum level lower than pupils not on free school meals in English, and just under 0.2 of a level in maths. But also, and that's quite a sizable effect. That's around about 5 months of progress if we conceptualize a level as something as originally conceived as a representing 2 years of progress or 24 months of progress. Then 0.2 of a level is kind of 5 months of progress. So quite a big gap. But even when we've controlled for that free school meal variable in our models at levels of individual students, we've taken into account every individual student's free school meal status, actually, and their ethnicity, their gender, their proficiency in English, whether they have an SEN, there's still, over and above that, an effect, a negative association of being in a school with a high concentration of deprivation. So these are quintiles again. These are the schools with the lowest level of free school meal entitlement. Going through to these are the 20% of schools with the highest level of free school meal entitlement. There's a negative concentration also being in a school with a high proportion of pupils who are disadvantaged. So, I mean, we've known this for a long time. My own research going back on school effectiveness right the way back to the early 90s found this. So it's not that we haven't known it. It's just that maybe it's got lost in the picture of the pupil level funding. Now, it's great that we do fund pupil premium directly. Every pupil who's entitled to a free school meal or has been entitled to a free school meal in its time in the last 6 years is entitled to the premium, but actually that pupil level funding is missing something, which is that concentration, that effect of being amongst a high proportion of young people. In a school context where there is high levels of deprivation, there's an added impact there. Now, it might be easy to think that these are just cumulative, these are just additive. So, if you're sort of likely to be scoring, 0.2 of a level lower if you're free school meals and 0.2 of a level lower if you're in a high free school meal as opposed to a low free school meal school, maybe that means you're kind of got double negative. But actually there are interesting patterns here. So the major impact, if we look separately at the effect of the concentration of deprivation on pupils on free school meals versus those not on free school meals, is particularly amongst those not on free school meals. So actually it's the fact that we're not picking up this high association between the pupils who are not on free school meals and their achievement related to deprivation of the school. That's the issue, and we're not funding any of these pupils. So I guess my point would be, if we look at the size of the largest gap here, this is around about 0.2 of a level of 5 months, but this is around about 0.2 of a level of 5 months as well. So it's a similar size gap. So do we need something like a school premium as well, something which in addition to the pupil premium recognizes that actually being in a school with a really high concentration of deprived pupils, it also has an additional impact? Because actually if we look at the free school meal gap, the free school meal gap is biggest in schools where there are few free school meal pupils. This gap here is larger than this gap here. So actually, as an individual student, if you're more isolated, if you're poor in an affluent context, that tends to be more damaging for you. But overall, if you're in a high deprivation context, that tends to be more damaging to the overall levels of achievement. So we need to recognize both, the pupil level and the school context level. Okay, let's move on. That was the fourth point. And the fifth point is really quite a fundamental one, really, about just how much variation there is in teacher assessed judgments about different kinds of outcomes between different schools or between different local authorities. So what's important here is we expect there to be some differences between schools because schools serve very different communities. But the question here would be, how much is the variation between different schools or different local authorities contributing to differences in the educational outcomes being assessed for students? So how much does it matter which particular school or which particular local authority you're in? How much will that influence your outcome? So I've just looked at three things here because I'm interested in how this pie judgment relates to other kind of outcomes. So if we look at pupil attainment, and we've got Key Stage 1 teacher assessment and Key Stage 2 teacher assessment here, let's just focus particularly on what proportion of the variation in those outcomes lies between schools as opposed to between pupils. And it's around about 8%. Yeah. So about 8% of the variability in students' outcomes in terms of their achievement at Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 relates to the school they're in. And that's understandable because schools are very different contexts. But there is a recognition there should be some variability to schools, but we have moderation procedures. We keep that to a relatively low level. But it's like you'd expect there to be some because schools are serving different communities. And maybe there are differences in effectiveness as well. That's quite an open, well, a contested question. But there are a whole range of factors. What's slightly more troubling is if I look about that judgment of the PI, the proficiency in English level, we find about at least twice as much of the variation seems to be at the school level compared to the amount of variation at the school level for pupil attainment. So there seems to be, it's making a lot more difference which school you're in if we're talking about judgments of proficiency in English than it does judgments of how you're doing in Key Stage 1 English or Key Stage 2 Maths or any of those attainment outcomes. So there seems to be a lot more noise or a lot more influence at the level of the individual professional making the judgment here at the school really level. And if we move on to the rate at which young people progress through from new to English through to competent fluent, or from any of the stages of acquiring English through to competent fluent, that doubles again. So then around about a third of the variation seems to be down to the school. So I guess what we're saying here is that there's a lot of variation in these judgments, which seems to be at the level of the school, or indeed, if we look at the three-level models, there's quite a lot at the level of local authorities as well, much more so than for judgments about pupil attainment. And that does suggest that actually who's making the judgment is quite an important part of the components. So, in terms of the reliability of the outcome, it seems to be that would be more heavily influenced by the school or the particular teacher making the assessment. That is important because there are a number of other issues in the data, particularly this distinction between competent and fluent, which would seem to reflect that distinction about the school level kind of components to this versus the pupil level components. First piece of evidence is if we just look over time at that Welsh data from 2009 through to 2016. We don't have absolutely complete data. We don't have reception for 2017. That's why I've curtailed it here. We see that there are a number of very discrete points at which there are substantial declines in the number of pupils who are rated as fluent. So in the first year we can see that 44% of EAL pupils are recorded as fluent, but in 2010 that jumped to around about a third, less than a third. And then again in 2014 another very big decline. So there seems to be a lot of change over time in who's being recorded as fluent or not. And talking to some colleagues within Wales, it's been hard to find concrete evidence, but this may relate to things like the way in which fluency has been used in funding structures. So, are you funding? Yes, funding stages A to D, but not E, and then changes maybe later to fund only A to C and not D. So there does seem to be some quite unexplained changes in the proportion of young people being rated, particularly at this competent fluent distinction. If we look back at the Welsh data, unlike the English data with the 2018 report, the Strand and Hessel report I spoke about earlier, what we find in a lot of these outcomes is that actually, even paradoxically, there don't seem to be the differences we would expect between competent and fluent speakers. So in many cases, competent and fluent speakers are doing equally well, rather than fluent speakers achieving higher levels than competent speakers. So the links to achievement don't seem to be appropriate. And then if we look down and dive into the local authority level, so this is our reception cohort of 90,000 young people, And these are the proportion who are rated in that perception cohort of 5,000 EAL pupils. We find that in two adjoining authorities, both of which have, which together account for, 40% of all EAL pupils in Wales, one rated 37% of its reception pupils as fluent, and the adjoining authority, this is next door, Newport is next door to Cardiff, and they share a border, and that's rating 7% of young people as fluent. Now overall, across all the local authorities, it's about 28%, so clearly, there seems to be something out of line at the local authority level, and one suspects this is reflecting quite fundamental differences in the approach to the assessment of fluency in English. So the scale as used was one of about a best fit judgment, and the fluency is about operating across the curriculum to a level of competence equivalent to that of a pupil who uses English as her first language, so without needing EAL support. Okay, so that's an interesting position. So you can be competent at any age. Okay. Whereas some other assessment approaches, and I picked, for example, the Northern Association of Support Services for Equality and Achievement, the NASU Guidance, when the A2E scale was introduced, they produced this guidance about how you would read across from their stages of fluency through to the new A2E scales, and they said that actually it would be not possible for any EAL pupil to be recorded as competent until at least Key Stage 3. So you couldn't actually be Key Stage 3 to 4, yeah. So that seems to preclude the possibility. Key Stage 2 actually, Key Stage start of Key Stage 3, so that would be 11. So if you're an EAL pupil, this would preclude you being recorded as fluent until the age of 11 at the absolute earliest. So these are very different approaches to assessment, extremely different, and I would argue that this is quite problematic, because what we've seen is EAL, you can be EAL and fully proficient in English, in fact in doing better than your monolingual peers in terms of educational achievement. We've seen that for a long time, and this kind of reifies frankly the lower expectations. Why would you not allow that to be the case? So we do have maybe fundamentally different approaches to what constitutes proficiency and how particularly we assess this competent versus fluent distinction in different frameworks. I think maybe for me, and this is obviously a question of judgment to some extent, it's important to look at the range of frameworks available, and I think a criterion reference approach like the Bell assessment, EAL assessment framework, maybe is the most effective one to use, because you've basically got 200 statements, because you break this, you've got separate primary and secondary frameworks, you break them into 4 domains. For each of the 5 levels A2E you have 10 descriptors, so you've got 200 kind of criterion reference statements about what a young person can or cannot do if they're at different stages of development. So this is just the stage C for primary, for example. These are the 10 statements that would relate to listening at stage C. Obviously that expands out to cover all the other areas and across then all 4 domains. And I think that actually is a particularly useful way of being able to generate information which is useful for directing teaching and learning, but also is integrated with the A2E scale. So I offer that, and it's all totally free, this material. I offer that as a very constructive way to approach the assessment of pupils with the AL. So let me wind up now, because I have gone on longer, as I always do inevitably. What do I think the implications are for policy in England? I say that because obviously this proficiency in English scale is being used in Wales, so I'm particularly focused on England, where it is no longer employed. First point is, it's quite clear that that we need a measure of pi. but it's also clear that there are some problems with the teacher assessed format. We know that PI is important, and we know that we're looking at least 6 years, but we only fund currently in the national funding formula in England for 3 years, extra £500 for the first 3 years for EAL pupils. And that seems to be less than the 6 years we're talking about as required for transition. That might be problematic, particularly in the era of COVID, when EAL pupils maybe are the ones who are particularly suffering from not being in school and not getting the exposure to the language of school instruction and to other peers who use that language. So we've got issues about targeting the funding, and I just want to raise, I suppose, some possibilities. So let's look at how other countries do it. Let's consider what other models are out there, and actually be willing to look at other contexts and how they work. USA, New Zealand, these are interesting contexts, and maybe think about how we might tweak that funding formula going forward to better support our young people acquiring English. So there are all the references I spoke to in the talk, and this presentation will go up, I think, Savannah, on the website, so this will be available to download, and so all these links are going to be live. I will stop there because I've done 45 minutes, haven't I? Ooh, ouch.
Very interesting 45 minutes.
I'll take any
very,
questions.
very interesting. Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you,
there are
Savannah.
quite a few questions.
How many we've got left in the room?
We've got pretty much everybody. Yes.
Don't get academics talking.
No, listen, there are quite a few.
We like the sound of our own
there
voices.
There are quite a few interesting questions. So let's get started. I would say in general they're about details and details of the context and differences between England and Wales. So you may be able to answer those. So Sarah says, did these findings look at whether these children had any targeted support in school for their English proficiency, either in class or with intervention classes?
No, we don't know. That would be a different kind of research. That would be you're recording what the state, what the level of proficiency is, but what are you actually doing about it? That would be a very different kind of research, and there's room for that as well, actually. So exactly what provision is being made, that would be really interesting to know, but not from this research.
Thank you, Steve. And another question from Sarah: is there any research or support for preschool age? She asks.
For preschool age, I mean, that's an interesting one. I mean, obviously nursery provision is not regulated in the same way, but you would hope that although it's going to be a play-based curriculum, that exposure to English would be a positive part of that experience. So I would, it's early years isn't my particular area of interest, but I would have thought it would be positive, and there will be research out there.
Thanks. Anne-Marie asks, do you have any stats for achievement in national qualifications for white other and other ethnic minority groups, for example, older age groups in Wales?
Well, the Welsh Government publish all their data in a very accessible format, actually, on the Welsh Government website. So actually, you can get access to all the sort of Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5 outcomes. Yeah, and it's possible to drill down into those to a reasonable level of detail. So the answer would be yes. I think you can probably find quite a lot on the government website.
Thanks. And there are here attempts to try and understand and interpret the data. So I'll just throw these at you, Steve. Simon says, are these figures, for example, white other, influenced by attendance at all?
Yeah, I mean, in research on England, I was able to look at attendance as well. What we know is for some groups, actually attendance tends to be higher than average, and yet they still have lower achievement. So this often is not about young people who don't attend. I think there are particular groups like traveller groups where actually there are known issues about that. But generally, I think attendance isn't the kind of underlying magic bullet that explains the variations in outcomes.
And Christina also is trying to understand as well, so that the same issue. So she says, could the delay in acquiring proficiency in the white other groups be due to unidentified SEND needs?
Yes, possibly. I mean, we had SEND in the model, so we controlled for SEND. So, but if the SEND wasn't identified, that's possible. But you'd have to have a good a priori reason for expecting that unidentified SEND should be higher in that particular ethnic group than in other groups. And I can't think of a particular reason why I would expect that.
Okay, thank you. Simon. No, sorry, I've asked that one. Yes, John Simpson says, you rightly mention Cummins, Biggs and Kaup distinction as relevant here. And I wonder if you see the data supporting evidence to a degree of the threshold hypothesis, the notion that individuals with high levels of proficiency in both languages experience cognitive advantages in terms of linguistic and cognitive flexibility, while low levels of proficiency in both languages result in cognitive deficits. Would you care to comment on this?
Yeah, I think that's kind of, the strength of this data set is in its breadth and its ability to relate very broad measures of educational achievement that we collect, across all students in the system, and these very broad levels of proficiency. The kind of research that the questions discuss in there probably are better answered by more targeted kind of often more experimental type research, which can look at very different aspects and with very small small groups rather than big national samples, but can look in a very targeted and focused way at how much proficiency you have in language 1 and how much proficiency in language 2, and the different areas of proficiency in your morphological knowledge and your vocabulary. And so I think there's a whole field of research on language acquisition which speaks to that, but this is a kind of differently focused research. It's about these broad patterns and what they might mean for things about overall levels of achievement, how we judge schools, how we fund schools, those kind of things.
Thank you. And a question from Khadija. He says, I wonder whether pie of parents or the household was controlled for, and whether there are any related insights on this.
No, we don't know anything about the proficiency in the second language, even presuming it is the second language. All we know is that these pupils are recorded as EAL and therefore presumably were exposed to a language other than English. We don't know anything about the extent to which they were exposed, whether that's a language that's spoken as the only language spoken in the home or whether it's not spoken in the home at all. So that's again not something we can get from this kind of very large scale data, which is unfortunate. But there are different data sets will address different questions, and I know there's a lot of research in the field of language acquisition, which is not my particular speciality, which will look at those kind of questions, and I know some's going on at Oxford. So I would say that there are answers to those kind of questions out there, but not in this particular research.
Thank you. And the last question, we have no more time for any others, I'm afraid. Simon, sorry if I missed this, but I understand in England parents and guardians can declare a child EAL just by ticking a box. Is that the same in Wales?
Yeah, I mean, I think you want to be informed by what usually you will interview, and you'll sit down with parents at the time a young person is joining school and have that conversation about the home and about the young person's background. And actually, if parents say that's what you ask them, and they say that that is the language background of the child, then that's what you record. The judgment, though, on going after that point about fluency is made by the school. The school judge the proficiency in English. I don't think the proficiency in English is something that's judged by the parents, although the EAL status is. And you can see how that makes sense, because you don't know what's happened in terms of language exposure of that student before they joined their school, your school. But you can make a judgment about how proficient you think they are in English after that point. So the two measures have different data sources in that sense.
So I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Thanks very much, Steve, for a very informative presentation with important implications for national and regional policy, funding and support for pupils who are speakers of English as an additional language. I'm going to round up now, but before I close this webinar, I just wanted to remind you that you will get an email tomorrow with a link to a video recording of this webinar and a survey. And that at the Bell Foundation, we have a number of upcoming events that are relevant to EAL assessment. So my colleague Emily will paste links now about the information I'm just about to share with you. So our next free webinar is on Wednesday, the 21st of April at 4 p.m. UK time, and it will be about assessment arrangements for 2021, implications for learners using EAL. So this webinar is aimed at school leaders, and it will explore how schools can support fair assessment of learners who use EAL following Ofqual's recent decisions on how GCSEs, ASs and A-level grades will be determined in summer 2021. There is another webinar in April on Wednesday the 28th at the same time, 4 o'clock UK time, and it's about teacher assessment in 2021, meeting the needs of learners who use EAL. And this free webinar is for teachers, secondary teachers, and it will explore how they can support learners with EAL to demonstrate knowledge and ability in teacher-led assessments. There are also a couple of short online courses on EAL assessment starting soon. Introduction to EAL assessment for UK-based staff only, running from the 19th of April to the 18th of May, and embedding EAL assessment for leaders from the 7th of June to the 2nd of July. So I hope you can join us, and it will be wonderful and great if you could spread the word about our upcoming webinars and courses among your colleagues and professional networks. Thanks very much for taking part in today's webinar, and special thanks to Steve for giving us your time so generously and sharing key findings of your research and their implications with us. We will stop recording now, and I'm going to end the meeting now. Thank you very much and goodbye.